The Galactic Math Summit was more than an event. It was a spectacle of unparalleled brilliance. Archeon 7, the floating station where it took place, hovered in the cosmos like a shimmering jewel. Its architecture, a blend of alien ingenuity and ancient designs, showcased spires made of translucent material that refracted starlight into dazzling patterns. Delegates from all corners of the galaxy arrived in vessels of various shapes and sizes, each symbolizing the unique technological achievements of their respective civilizations. Dr. Ethan Carter had never felt so out of place. As the representative of Earth, a relatively young and less advanced civilization in galactic terms, he was well aware of the skepticism surrounding his presence. Walking through the luminous hallways of Archeon 7, he couldn't help but marvel at the diversity around him. Beings of every imaginable form conversed in the universal language translator's soft hum. There were towering beings with crystalline bodies that shimmered like prisms, gelatinous entities that pulsed with bioluminescence, and insectoid creatures whose multiple limbs gestured with intricate precision as they debated mathematical theories. Ethan, in contrast, looked painfully ordinary in his tailored suit, his dark hair slightly disheveled from the long journey, and his deep brown eyes scanned the crowd nervously. He clutched a slim digital tablet, his only tool in this gathering of galactic intellectual giants. Earth's invitation to the summit was more symbolic than practical, a gesture of goodwill to acknowledge humanity's growing curiosity about the cosmos. Yet Ethan wasn't here to make a statement. He was here to observe, learn, and maybe contribute in whatever small way he could. The grand auditorium where the opening ceremony was held was a marvel of engineering. Its dome-like structure seemed to extend infinitely, with holographic constellations swirling above. Rows of seating descended in concentric circles toward a central platform where the event's keynote speaker, Professor Xylar of the Yiltar race, was about to begin. Xylar was a towering figure both literally and metaphorically. His elongated frame, covered in shimmering blue scales, radiated an air of authority. His three eyes glowed faintly, reflecting his species' reputation for unparalleled intellect. Ethan settled into his seat, trying to remain inconspicuous. The air was thick with anticipation as Xylar stepped onto the platform. A hush fell over the audience, and the holographic constellations above morphed into complex equations that danced across the ceiling. "Welcome, esteemed delegates," Xylar began, his voice a deep resonance that seemed to vibrate through the room. "Today we gather to confront the pinnacle of mathematical challenge, a problem that has eluded even the most advanced minds across the galaxy. The infinity paradox." The mention of the equation sent ripples of murmurs through the crowd. Ethan leaned forward, his curiosity piqued. He had read about the infinity paradox in the summit's briefings. It was a hyper-equation, discovered on a derelict space station centuries ago, said to hold the key to unlocking ancient energy technology. Despite countless attempts by the most advanced civilizations, it remained unsolved. Xylar continued, his tone tinged with pride. "This equation is not merely a test of intellect. It is a measure of the potential of our collective species. Solving it would not only grant us access to untold energy reserves, but also redefine our understanding of the universe itself." A massive holographic display materialized in the center of the auditorium, projecting the infinity paradox for all to see. The equation was a sprawling maze of symbols, each pulsating with an otherworldly glow. Ethan's eyes widened as he tried to make sense of it. The equation wasn't just complex, it was alien in its very essence, defying the rules of logic and mathematics he was familiar with. Yet there was something strangely captivating about it, as though it held a rhythm or pattern waiting to be uncovered. Xylar's voice grew sharper. "And yet, despite the combined efforts of our brightest minds, this equation remains an enigma. Some say it is unsolvable, a cruel trick left behind by a long-extinct race, but I believe otherwise. It is a challenge, a beacon calling to those worthy of its secrets." Ethan noticed the subtle glances directed toward him by some of the delegates. He could almost hear their thoughts. What could a human possibly contribute here? Earth's mathematical achievements were still rooted in what the galaxy considered rudimentary. He forced himself to ignore the whispers of doubt and focused on the equation. His hands tightened around his tablet as he began jotting down notes, his mind already working to identify familiar elements. As Xylar continued his address, he turned his gaze toward Ethan, his expression unreadable. We welcome all perspectives, no matter how primitive they may seem. Even the smallest voice can spark the greatest ideas. The faint smirk on Xylar's face didn't escape Ethan's notice, but he refused to let it rattle him. Instead, he nodded respectfully, determined to prove that humanity's perspective wasn't as insignificant as they believed. The rest of the ceremony proceeded with presentations from various delegates, each offering their preliminary analysis of the infinity paradox. Ethan listened intently, scribbling notes and occasionally shaking his head at the convoluted approaches being discussed. It wasn't that he thought himself superior, far from it, but many of the solutions seemed overly reliant on advanced technology and lacked a fundamental understanding of the equation's structure. By the time the ceremony ended, Ethan felt a mixture of awe and apprehension. He was surrounded by brilliance, yet he couldn't shake the feeling that the answer to the infinity paradox wasn't in advanced algorithms or hyperdimensional computations. It was in simplicity, in seeing the equation not as a problem to be conquered, but as a puzzle to be understood. As the delegates dispersed to their respective quarters, Ethan lingered in the auditorium, staring at the holographic equation that still hovered in the air. He knew the odds were against him. He was just one human among a galaxy of intellectual titans. But as he studied the equation, he couldn't help but feel a spark of hope. There was something familiar about the patterns, a rhythm that reminded him of Earth's chaotic systems, of fractals and infinite loops. Maybe, he thought to himself, the answer lies not in what we see, but in how we look at it. With that thought, he turned and left the auditorium, ready to face the challenge ahead. As the second day of the Galactic Math Summit dawned, Archeon 7 was abuzz with activity. Delegates from dozens of advanced civilizations crowded the conference halls, their discussions brimming with complex theories and bold predictions. The infinity paradox was on everyone's mind, and despite the previous day's grandeur, no real progress had been made. Among the delegates, tension was beginning to simmer. This was more than an intellectual challenge. Solving the equation was a matter of prestige, and failure would mean collective humiliation. Dr. Ethan Carter woke early, his mind still buzzing from the events of the previous day. He had spent the night reviewing his notes, sketching patterns and formulas in his digital tablet. Every time he thought he was making progress, the equation seemed to slip through his mental grasp, its complexity mocking him. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was something he was missing, something vital that lay hidden beneath its layers of complexity. The summit's schedule for the day began with a series of workshops, each hosted by delegates from the most advanced civilizations. Ethan attended out of curiosity, eager to understand how other species approached the equation. The first session was led by the Archlorians, a crystalline species known for their hyperlogical thinking. Their lead mathematician, a glittering figure named Orlix, projected a dazzling three-dimensional model of the infinity paradox into the air. Orlix explained how their approach relied on splitting the equation into infinite subsets, each corresponding to a unique dimension of space-time. Ethan watched as the delegates nodded in agreement, impressed by the elegance of the Archlorians' theory. But as Orlix elaborated further, Ethan noticed a flaw in the logic. The subsets, while mathematically sound, didn't seem to account for the equation's non-linear behavior. It was as though they were trying to solve a puzzle by cutting it into smaller pieces that no longer fit together. Ethan raised his hand hesitantly, drawing curious glances from the audience. "Excuse me, Orlix," Ethan began, his voice steady despite his nervousness. Your method is brilliant, but doesn't splitting the equation into subsets risk losing the relationships between the variables? The non-linear interactions seem to be a critical part of the problem. The room fell silent. Orlix's crystalline body flickered for a moment, a sign of contemplation. "An interesting observation, human," Orlix said, his voice reverberating like chimes. "But our analysis suggests that these interactions are negligible compared to the primary variables." Ethan nodded, though he wasn't entirely convinced. He returned to his seat, his mind racing. If even the Arclorians were overlooking something so fundamental, perhaps the solution lay in a completely different approach. The next session was even more perplexing. Hosted by the Xenar, a species of telepathic beings, it involved a collective mental simulation of the equation. Ethan found himself standing awkwardly in the middle of a circle of Xenar delegates, their elongated heads glowing faintly as they synchronized their thoughts. They invited him to participate, claiming that a unified consciousness might reveal insights no individual could achieve. Ethan agreed, though he wasn't sure how his mind could possibly integrate with theirs. The experience was overwhelming. For a brief moment he felt his thoughts blending with theirs, his consciousness expanding into a vast network of ideas and possibilities. But the sensation was fleeting, and as the Xenar concluded their simulation, Ethan realized they were no closer to a solution than before. The infinity paradox remained as elusive as ever, its complexity defying even the combined intellect of the Xenar. By midday, Ethan felt both inspired and disheartened. The sheer brilliance of the other delegates was undeniable, yet their approaches all seemed to falter when faced with the equation's core mystery. It wasn't just a mathematical problem, it was a riddle, one that required not just knowledge, but also intuition and creativity. As he wandered through the summit's sprawling halls, Ethan found himself drawn to the observation deck, a quiet space overlooking the vast expanse of the galaxy. He stood there for a while, gazing at the stars and letting his mind wander. The infinity paradox lingered in his thoughts, its symbols etched into his memory. He thought about Earth, about the simplicity of its systems compared to the galaxy's grandeur. Yet, Earth's simplicity often hid profound complexity. Could that be the key? His musings were interrupted by a voice. "Lost in thought, human?" Ethan turned to see Professor Xylar approaching, his tall, shimmering form imposing even in the relaxed atmosphere of the observation deck. There was a faint smirk on Xylar's face, though his tone was more curious than condescending. "Just trying to make sense of it all," Ethan replied, keeping his voice polite. "The equation, the approach, everything." Xylar tilted his head, his 3 eyes glinting with amusement. "And do you believe your earthly perspective holds the answer?" Ethan hesitated. "I don't know," he admitted. "But I think sometimes looking at a problem from a different angle can reveal things others might miss." Xylar studied him for a moment before nodding. "A fair point. But beware, human. Arrogance is a dangerous trap, even for those with noble intentions. The infinity paradox has humbled minds far greater than yours." With that, Xylar turned and walked away, leaving Ethan alone with his thoughts. The encounter only strengthened Ethan's resolve. He didn't need to prove anything to Xylar or anyone else. He was here to understand, to contribute in whatever way he could, and if that meant thinking differently, so be it. The day ended with a roundtable discussion, where delegates shared updates on their progress. Ethan chose to listen rather than speak, absorbing the wealth of knowledge and perspectives around him. He noticed that while many approaches were advanced, they all seemed to share a common flaw. They treated the equation as an opponent to be conquered rather than a puzzle to be solved. As the discussion drew to a close, Ethan felt a renewed sense of determination. He didn't have the technology or resources of the other civilizations, but he had something they seemed to lack, a willingness to embrace simplicity and intuition. Perhaps that was what the infinity paradox required. Returning to his quarters, Ethan sat down at his desk and began sketching the equation from memory. This time, he didn't try to dissect it or break it down. Instead, he let his thoughts flow freely, allowing patterns and connections to emerge naturally. Hours passed, and as he worked, a faint glimmer of understanding began to take shape in his mind. For the first time since arriving at the summit, Ethan felt a spark of hope. The road ahead was still uncertain, but he was determined to see it through. The infinity paradox wasn't just a test of intellect, it was a challenge to see the universe in a new way, and Ethan was ready to rise to that challenge. The third day of the Galactic Math Summit began with a sense of urgency. The infinity paradox had hung over the delegates like a storm cloud, its elusive solution mocking their collective brilliance. Ethan Carter, however, approached the day with quiet determination. After the long hours he'd spent the previous night examining the equation from every conceivable angle, he began to sense a subtle pattern hidden beneath its layers of complexity. He didn't have a full solution, not yet, but he had a direction. The morning sessions were as rigorous as ever, filled with complex theories and arguments between delegates. Ethan sat through another round of presentations, this time led by the Hythorians, a race of translucent beings whose neural networks were said to function like quantum computers. Their mathematicians introduced a radical approach that involved applying probabilistic computations to approximate the equation's solution. The holographic projections they displayed were stunning in their intricacy, and the room buzzed with murmurs of approval. Ethan watched intently, his tablet resting on his lap as he scribbled notes. The Hythorians' work was undeniably brilliant, but as their demonstration continued, he began to notice a flaw. Their computations relied heavily on assumptions about the equation's variables, assumptions that Ethan suspected were incorrect. He leaned forward, his brow furrowing as he considered the implications. When the presentation ended, Ethan hesitated. He wasn't sure if it was his place to speak, especially given the skepticism he had faced on previous days. But as he glanced at the infinity paradox displayed on the central hologram, he knew he couldn't remain silent. "Excuse me," Ethan began, rising from his seat. The room quieted, dozens of alien eyes turning toward him. He felt a familiar pang of nervousness, but pushed through it. "Your method is impressive, but I think there's a potential issue with how you're treating the equation's variables. The interactions between them aren't just random. They're part of a larger structure. If we treat them probabilistically, we might miss the relationships that hold the entire system together." The lead Hythorian mathematician, a shimmering figure named Vorthix, tilted its semi-translucent head. Its body emitted a faint pulsating glow that Ethan interpreted as a sign of curiosity. "And what evidence supports your claim, human?" Vorthix asked, its voice a melodic hum. Ethan took a deep breath. "I've been analyzing the equation from a different perspective. It's not just a mathematical problem, it's a riddle. The variables interact in ways that resemble patterns found in natural systems, like fractals or chaotic dynamics. If we approach it with the assumption that the structure itself holds meaning, rather than reducing it to probabilities, we might find a way forward." A ripple of murmurs swept through the room. Some delegates seemed intrigued, while others exchanged skeptical glances. Vorthix regarded Ethan for a moment before responding. "An interesting perspective, human. But speculation without evidence is of little value." Ethan nodded, unperturbed. "I agree. I'm not claiming to have the solution yet. But I believe this approach is worth exploring." The discussion moved on, and Ethan returned to his seat. He noticed a few delegates glancing at him with a mix of curiosity and doubt. It didn't matter. He wasn't here to seek approval. He was here to solve the equation. After the session, Ethan retreated to the observation deck once again. The stars outside seemed brighter today, their light cutting through the station's transparent walls. He stood there for a while, staring at the swirling patterns of the galaxy, letting his thoughts drift. The infinity paradox lingered in his mind, its symbols etched into his memory. As he considered the equation's complexity, he began to see parallels with the universe itself, a chaotic yet ordered system, full of hidden connections waiting to be discovered. His contemplation was interrupted by a soft voice. "You think differently, human. That's rare." Ethan turned to see an alien delegate standing nearby. She was from a species he hadn't encountered before, tall and slender, with skin that shimmered like liquid silver. Her eyes, a deep shade of violet, seemed to pierce through him. "I'm trying to," Ethan replied cautiously. "Sometimes a different perspective is all we need." The alien nodded, her expression unreadable. "Most of us are blinded by our own brilliance. We see complexity and assume the solution must be equally complex. But perhaps simplicity is the answer." Ethan blinked, surprised by her words. "You think the infinity paradox has a simple solution?" "Not simple in the way you think," she said, "but simplicity can emerge from complexity, like order from chaos. The trick is seeing the pattern beneath the noise." Her words lingered in Ethan's mind long after she left. He returned to his quarters and began working on the equation once again, this time focusing on its structure rather than its individual components. He analyzed the relationships between the variables, mapping out their interactions in intricate diagrams. The more he worked, the more he began to see the equation not as a problem to be solved, but as a story to be understood. Hours passed, and Ethan's desk became cluttered with notes and sketches. His tablet displayed a sprawling network of equations, each connected by lines and arrows that represented their relationships. It was a mess, but it was a mess that made sense to him. He could feel the solution drawing closer, like a faint light at the end of a long tunnel. As he worked, Ethan thought about Earth, about the simple systems that often held profound truths. He thought about fractals, about the way a single pattern could repeat endlessly, creating complexity from simplicity. He thought about the stars, about the way they seemed to dance in perfect harmony despite the chaos of the universe. By the time Ethan finally set down his pen, he felt a surge of hope. He didn't have the full solution yet, but he was beginning to see the outline of it. The infinity paradox wasn't just a mathematical equation. It was a reflection of the universe itself, a puzzle that required not just intellect, but intuition and creativity. As he lay down to rest, Ethan couldn't help but smile. For the first time since arriving at the summit, he felt like he was on the right path. The road ahead was still long, but he was determined to see it through. The infinity paradox wouldn't remain a mystery forever, not if he had anything to say about it. Ethan awoke on the fourth day of the summit feeling an unusual mixture of anticipation and resolve. The puzzle of the infinity paradox was no longer an overwhelming abstraction in his mind. It had transformed into a tangible challenge, a story waiting to be unraveled. His late-night work had yielded fragments of understanding, glimpses of a pattern that seemed to hum beneath the equation's complexity. But he knew he needed more time and, perhaps, more courage to bring those fragments into a cohesive whole. The day's proceedings began with a palpable sense of urgency. The delegates, now visibly weary from days of intense deliberations, gathered in the central auditorium for another round of presentations. Many of them had spent the previous night revising their theories, each hoping to gain an edge in the race to solve the equation. Ethan found himself observing the room more closely than before, his mind cataloging the subtle signs of frustration and determination etched onto faces both alien and familiar. The session opened with an announcement from the summit's organizers. A new, final challenge was being introduced, a dedicated time slot for individual delegates to publicly present their progress on the infinity paradox. Each presenter would have the opportunity to defend their approach, receive feedback, and, if possible, demonstrate a breakthrough. The announcement was met with a mix of excitement and trepidation. The stakes had never been higher. As the session progressed, Ethan's attention shifted between the holographic projections on the stage and his own notes. The presentations were a parade of brilliance, each delegate showcasing their civilization's unique mathematical prowess. The Cythorians, with their hyperdimensional models, argued that the equation was a gateway to understanding parallel universes. The Zelfarians, a race of gaseous beings, proposed that the solution lay in oscillatory waveforms that resonated across dimensions. Each theory was dazzling in its own right, but none seemed to capture the full essence of the equation. Ethan sat quietly, his tablet resting on his lap, as the room filled with murmurs of admiration and skepticism. He knew his turn was approaching, and the weight of that realization settled heavily on his shoulders. His presentation wouldn't have the grandeur of the others, no holographic displays, no advanced simulations, but he believed in his approach. He had to. When his name was called, a hush fell over the auditorium. Ethan rose from his seat, his heart pounding as he made his way to the stage. The holographic display in the center of the room shimmered, awaiting his input. Taking a deep breath, he connected his tablet to the system, projecting his notes and diagrams onto the screen. "Good morning," Ethan began, his voice steady despite the tension in the air. "I'm Dr. Ethan Carter, representing Earth. Over the past few days, I've been analyzing the infinity paradox not just as a mathematical equation, but as a system, a living structure with its own internal logic." He paused, scanning the room for reactions. Most of the delegates looked intrigued, though a few seemed skeptical. Professor Zylar, seated in the front row, regarded him with an unreadable expression. "I've noticed that many of the approaches presented so far focus on breaking the equation into smaller parts, or applying advanced computational models to approximate a solution. These methods are brilliant, but I believe they overlook something fundamental: the relationships between the variables. The infinity paradox isn't just a sum of its parts. It's a network, a system, where every component influences every other. If we ignore those relationships, we miss the equation's true nature." Ethan's fingers moved across his tablet, manipulating the holographic display to show a simplified representation of the equation. He highlighted key variables and their interactions, using color-coded lines to illustrate the connections. "What if," he continued, "instead of treating the equation as a problem to be solved, we treated it as a story to be understood? What if the answer isn't in the variables themselves, but in the way they interact, like threads weaving a larger tapestry?" The room was silent, the delegates leaning forward in their seats. Ethan took a deep breath and pressed on. "Using this perspective, I've been working to identify patterns within the equation, recurring structures that hint at its underlying logic. One of these patterns resembles a concept we call fractals on Earth. Self-replicating structures that appear complex but are built from simple, repeating rules." He demonstrated the concept by overlaying a fractal pattern onto the equation, highlighting areas where the structures aligned. The projection shifted, revealing a mesmerizing web of interconnections that seemed to pulse with life. "I believe the infinity paradox is a fractal system," Ethan concluded. "Its complexity arises from the repetition of simple rules across multiple dimensions. If we can identify those rules and understand how they interact, we can unravel the equation's secrets." For a moment, the room remained silent. Then, murmurs began to ripple through the audience. Some delegates whispered to their neighbors, while others examined the holographic projection with newfound interest. Professor Zylar, still seated in the front row, leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "An intriguing perspective," Zylar said finally, his voice cutting through the murmurs. "But perspectives alone do not solve equations. Do you have proof, Dr. Carter? Can you demonstrate that your theory holds merit?" Ethan hesitated. He didn't have a complete solution, not yet. But he had something close, something that hinted at the equation's deeper truths. "I can't claim to have solved the infinity paradox," he admitted, "but I've identified the framework of its structure. I believe this approach is the key to finding the solution." The murmurs grew louder, and Ethan braced himself for criticism. But, to his surprise, several delegates nodded in agreement. The concept of fractals, though unfamiliar to many species, resonated with their own understanding of natural systems. After the session, Ethan returned to his quarters, his mind racing. The feedback he had received was both encouraging and humbling. He had taken a step forward, but the journey was far from over. As he reviewed his notes and diagrams, he began to refine his theory, searching for the simple rules that could unlock the equation's secrets. For the first time, he felt not just hope, but certainty. The infinity paradox wasn't an insurmountable challenge, it was a puzzle waiting to be solved. And Ethan was closer than ever to finding the answer. Ethan's final day at the Galactic Math Summit began in silence. The quiet of his quarters contrasted sharply with the hum of activity in the station's halls, where delegates prepared for the summit's conclusion. The infinity paradox hung in the air like an unresolved chord, its elusive solution driving the mood to a fever pitch. Ethan sat at his desk, staring at his tablet. He felt the weight of anticipation pressing down on him. This was it. The last chance to prove his theory, to bring his work to completion. The previous night had been a whirlwind of calculations and breakthroughs. After presenting his fractal-based approach, Ethan had received a flurry of questions and suggestions from the delegates. Some were dismissive, others encouraging, but all had pushed him to refine his ideas. By the early hours of the morning, he had begun to see the equation in a new light. The fractal structure wasn't just a metaphor, it was the key to unlocking the equation's true meaning. He took a deep breath and reviewed his notes one last time. The infinity paradox wasn't just a mathematical problem. It was a representation of a system far more profound. Its variables, once thought to be disconnected, were part of a self-replicating pattern that extended across dimensions. The solution wasn't about computation, it was about understanding the system as a whole. When the announcement came summoning the delegates to the final session, Ethan felt a surge of determination. He rose from his seat, tablet in hand, and made his way to the central auditorium. The hall was filled with a sense of anticipation as the delegates took their places, their discussions hushed but intense. On the central stage, the holographic display of the infinity paradox shimmered, its symbols pulsing faintly as if alive. The summit's moderator, a tall insectoid being named Gelcor, addressed the audience. "Esteemed delegates," Gelcor began, his voice a series of clicks and whirs translated into speech. "We have reached the final session of this year's summit. Today we invite those who believe they have made significant progress on the infinity paradox to present their findings." Several delegates rose to speak, each presenting their theories with the precision and brilliance expected of the galaxy's finest minds. Ethan listened intently, his respect for his peers growing with each presentation. The solutions they proposed were bold and innovative, yet none seemed to fully capture the equation's essence. As the session continued, the weight of expectation began to settle over the room. Time was running out, and the equation remained unsolved. Finally, Gelcor turned to Ethan. "Dr. Ethan Carter of Earth," he announced, "you have been invited to present your findings." Ethan stood, his heart pounding as he made his way to the stage. He connected his tablet to the holographic display, projecting his diagrams and calculations onto the screen. Taking a deep breath, he addressed the audience. "Over the past few days," he began, "I've been analyzing the infinity paradox, not just as a mathematical equation, but as a system, a network of interconnected relationships. What I've discovered is that the equation is built on a fractal structure, a self-replicating pattern that exists across multiple dimensions." He gestured to the hologram, which now displayed a simplified representation of the equation overlaid with fractal patterns. "This structure isn't just a feature of the equation, it's the key to its solution. By understanding the rules that govern these patterns, we can unlock the equation's secrets." The room was silent, the delegates watching intently as Ethan continued. "I've identified 3 fundamental rules that define the equation's behavior. First, each variable interacts with its neighbors in a way that amplifies their influence. Second, the system as a whole evolves through recursive iterations, with each iteration building on the previous one. And third, the solution lies not in isolating the variables, but in understanding the emergent behavior of the system. He paused, his gaze sweeping the audience. Using these principles, I've developed a model that replicates the equation's structure. By applying this model, I've been able to simplify the equation into a form that reveals its underlying logic. Ethan manipulated his tablet, and the hologram shifted to display the simplified equation. The once chaotic maze of symbols now appeared as a harmonious pattern, its complexity resolved into elegant symmetry. A ripple of murmurs spread through the audience as the delegates leaned forward, their expressions a mix of awe and disbelief. This, Ethan concluded, is the solution to the infinity paradox. It's not just a mathematical result. It's a representation of a system that embodies the principles of recursion, emergence, and interconnectedness. By understanding these principles, we can unlock the equation's full potential. For a moment, the room was silent. Then, a wave of applause erupted, filling the auditorium with a sound Ethan had never expected to hear. Delegates from across the galaxy rose to their feet, their expressions ranging from admiration to outright astonishment. Even Professor Xylar, who had been one of Ethan's harshest critics, nodded in approval. Zelkor stepped forward, his voice resonating with emotion. "Dr. Ethan Carter," he said, "you have achieved what many believed to be impossible. Your work has not only solved the infinity paradox, but also demonstrated the value of a fresh perspective. On behalf of the summit, I congratulate you." Ethan felt a surge of relief and pride as he stepped down from the stage. Delegates approached him, offering their congratulations and asking questions about his work. For the first time, he felt truly accepted as an equal among the galaxy's brightest minds. As the summit drew to a close, Ethan found himself on the observation deck, gazing at the stars. The infinity paradox had been more than a mathematical challenge. It had been a journey of discovery, one that had pushed him to his limits and forced him to see the universe in a new way. He thought about Earth, about the small planet that had sent him here, and felt a deep sense of gratitude. The stars seemed to shine a little brighter that night, their light a reminder that even the most complex puzzles could be solved with patience, creativity, and determination. Ethan smiled, knowing that the journey was far from over. The infinity paradox was just the beginning.